Welcome to Success in Brief with your host, Rosanne Felicello. In every episode, we feature successful women attorneys and other business professionals to reflect on what career advice would you give your younger self. We hope to provide insights and inspiration toward your professional success. You can find this show at www.felicellolaw.com and on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and more. Now, here's the host of Success in Brief, Rosanne Felicello.
Good morning. Actually, good afternoon, I should say. My name is Rosanne Felicello, and this is Success in Brief. And I'm thrilled today to welcome my dear friend, Rosannes Marsico, to today's podcast. Robin, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, I'm happy to be here. I'm flattered to be asked.
Robin is a successful attorney and a good friend, and I'm excited to hear all of the great things she's going to tell us on today's podcast about how she actually came to be where she is and her continued success. First things first, though, Robin, as you know, it's bar exam time across the country. I think next week is the big day, and many recent graduates are thinking about their legal careers and what's next. And what is the number one piece of advice that you would offer to today's law school graduates?
I would tell them that they've got to take the long view about things. I think that too many people, and maybe even more so with younger people today, they've had this expectation that success follows immediately upon completing a task, and as if it was like clockwork or as if it was on a schedule. And maybe their lives have been scheduled throughout their childhood, but real life does not work that way. So just take the long view. You may not be happy with what you're doing for the first year or even the first 5 years. You've got your degree, so you're more than halfway to where you want to be. So be calm and just remember that life is a journey and it's going to take a while. Don't be impatient.
That's super advice. I think it's always interesting. You don't really know where it's going to take you, right? So you need to be a little bit flexible, I would say.
Right. And I think people tend to get anxious, and I know that sometimes the ability not to be nervous is kind of innate. And for those who are more prone to be nervous or to worry, you've got to take that extra effort to sit down and just think about, just remind yourself that there's a lot going on and visualize various scenarios and just be mindful that anything can happen and it's not always, and it's not usually the worst case scenario.
And there's always another door to open up, right?
Exactly. Always. Especially if your mindset, especially if you're looking for other doors and you've got a general idea of what you want. And just be open, to new opportunities and be honest with yourself and assess if you're in a situation that's not making you happy. Take a step back and again, take the long view and say, do I want to do this, or is there something I'd rather do, or is there something I can change so that in myself or with what I'm doing to make what I'm doing more enjoyable or palatable. I just also want to emphasize that work is not fun. If it was fun, they wouldn't call it work. So you've got to accept that there's a certain amount of just a grind. And that's true in any job, it's not just lawyers, any job. I remember I went out to Hollywood once. I worked in LA briefly, and someone I knew was a writer on a sitcom who I don't even remember what the show was, nor did I ever watch it. But I was able to attend a taping, and I'm watching them tape it, and they stop and they start. And after about 20 minutes, I'm like, this is work. This is really work. It looks fun, but it's work. They have to do the same thing over and over until it's right. They have to get into the mindset, and it's exhausting. And then we all went out for like an after party. And by 11 o'clock, they were all going home. And I'm like, you're kidding. It's early. Like, oh, we're tired. So it's just because your job is not fun doesn't mean that something is wrong. So.
But yeah, that's also, I think, sometimes the younger, as you're starting out in your career, you just expect that it's going to be enjoyable immediately. And while there's aspects that certainly are enjoyable about the work that we do, not every day is going to be rainbows, right?
Exactly.
And I think that's something people need to keep in mind.
Right. Yeah, that's true in all aspects of your life. Being in a relationship, having children, it's not always great. or anything, even volunteer work. Oh, you love what you do, within your volunteer work, but sometimes it could get a little onerous, or personalities make it a little less enjoyable. So, it's just general.
So speaking of work, you work in the Supreme Court of the state of New York, which is
Yes.
the trial level court here in New York.
Right.
Right. And could you please explain for our listeners what your role is in the court system?
Okay, so my official title is principal court attorney, and I work for an acting Supreme Court judge. And as a court attorney, I mean, it has various titles. In federal court, they're called law clerks. But at the trial level, there's a lot that goes on in chambers. I mean, the judge's primary role is to try cases and to hear arguments. And the court attorney's role is to assist the judge with getting all of that done. So, for instance, in a trial, we just came off of a very long, lengthy trial. My role wasn't that much during the trial, but if there were issues that I needed to research quickly for the judge, I would be prepared to do that. But prior to the trial, I had to meet with the attorneys, and then a little bit during the trial to prepare jury charges, which is the law as it will be described to the jurors afterward, and also help them with their verdict sheet, which is what's given to the jurors when they go to deliberate. But that's actually a very small part of what I do. The bulk of it is once the judge has heard motions or read through the papers and decided a motion, she writes down how she thinks the motion should be decided. And it's my job to discuss it with her and then basically draft the opinion for her signature. So that takes up the bulk of my day, but also answering emails from litigants who have questions about procedure. We have a lot of interns, and I run the internship program where I, set up. Well, it's all online now because of the pandemic, but if it was in person, which I hopefully next summer it will be, just coordinating little lunch meetings with the judge and getting topics and getting assigned readings for them. I'm going through their writing samples just to really help them. And this is something that not everyone does, but this is, the judge likes to do a lot of outreach to young people, especially young people interested in the law. So we believe that this program is really something that benefits them. And we've gotten good feedback. We've done it for the last few years. There's a lot of administrative work that I do, which is kind of hard to quantify, but it's keeping our docket straight, figuring out, is there a motion decided? Has it been, is it documented as decided in the system? It's hard to quit. It's something new every day. But for the most part, the bulk drafting the decisions, that is pretty consistent, and that's something that I do every day. And now we have a lot of them because we've switched to a different part, and we're just getting a lot more smaller commercial cases. And again, it's pretty dry. The work is pretty dry, but it's important. These litigants need to have a decision, and they need to know how to move forward on the breach of contract claims, money's at stake, or leases, things like that. So that's pretty much what our caseload is like now. Prior to this, we were in a part that only dealt with cases brought against the New York City transit system. So, I fell on a bus. Oh, the bus clipped my car. I slipped in the subway. And that too, those are important cases too for those who are injured. And also, just in general. I mean, any case is important to the litigants, and the court respects that. And we just try to move things along as efficiently as we can. And that, I think my biggest challenge is just moving things along because the volume is such that it's just, the work is endless.
It's endless.
So I mean, in the private sector, I worked for the bulk of my career in the private sector, and you'd stay routinely 12 hours. You'd feel you needed to, and you had to get your billable hours in. In the courthouse, I could easily work an 18-hour day because the work is always there, and I still have that mindset where, oh my God, I need to finish that, but that's not healthy.
No.
And the courthouse actually locks up at 5 o'clock, so you really have to get out of there.
So that's helpful.
At least there's an end to my day. So
that's interesting. So I was going to ask you, because I know you've had a varied legal career, if you could tell us about some of your past, legal positions before you became a clerk in the court, or principal attorney,
court attorney.
Court attorney. If you could just elucidate us a little bit on some of those prior positions.
Right. Well, I'll try to be brief because it was a bit of a winding journey. I mean, I always knew I wanted to go to law school, but I had no lawyers in the family and I didn't really know what it would entail. And I thought that for some reason, I thought that litigation involved crazy hours. And I thought, oh, I don't want to do litigation. So I sought out and I got a job doing transactional work at a small firm, thinking the work, the hours wouldn't be bad. But within 2 months, it merged with a very large firm from the West Coast. And in addition to being now in a big firm environment, which I didn't really want, I came to learn that transactional work was just as crazy hours wise as litigation. And most crucially, I found that I had no intellectual facility for transactional work. I mean, I'm bad at math. And when you're a low-level associate, you're doing proofreading and stuff that's relatively easy. But I just honestly sometimes didn't know what I was doing. So I kind of stuck it out for a little while. And I actually started working I had gotten a second job. There was a time when the headhunters would just recruit and they'd shuffle you around because it was a boom in the late 80s. And I ended up working at a firm that was doing a lot of acquisition work. And again, it was a mid-sized firm. It was not a huge firm. And unfortunately, and I'll say this now, which at the time I was just mortified, but at the time, this particular firm, which is no longer in business, would hire attorneys to staff their deals, and then when they didn't need the attorneys anymore, they'd let them go, and they would try to do that within 6 months, so they wouldn't have to pay the finder's fee to the headhunter.
Oh my goodness!
So that happened to me, and little did I know that it happened to many people in my firm. We were all just so mortified that we were let go that nobody said anything, including myself. And I only found out when I was interviewing for other jobs. I ran into a classmate who was working at another firm, and he's like, "Oh yeah, we know your firm. Yeah," he goes, "They have this reputation. They keep firing people." Because of course I was not telling people I was fired. I was trying to dance around that. So that was horrible at the time. And honestly, this is the first time that I'm actually telling this to someone, telling this publicly, other than to close family. But I think it's a good indication of how you can't take things personally. Law can be a business. It can be pretty ruthless.
Mm-hmm.
And you just have to, get up, dust yourself off, and move on. But I will say that it actually was a blessing in disguise, because in looking for a job, I ended up starting as a litigator in a firm that was looking for someone with 0 to 3 years experience. And I was already out of school 2 years. And that was probably the best thing that ever happened to me, because then that's when I became a litigator. I worked for a small insurance defense firm. The people were great. At every small firm I've worked at, even if the bosses weren't the greatest, there was always camaraderie. And I think that's really a function of small firms. You have to be able to get along because there's too few of you.
There's too few of you.
You can't get lost in a 200-person firm. The weirdos you can avoid them. They hide. It's fine. But in a small 5-6-person firm, 10-person, even 20, everyone gets along. And that pretty much started my career as a litigator, doing insurance defense and just some general commercial stuff, fraud claims and other business torts. And it was very interesting. And you know what? I liked the work. It was interesting when it wasn't tedious, like all work is. And I just moved around to a couple of firms. I ended up not working for a period of 13 years because someone that I had worked with started his own firm, and I enjoyed working with him. I went to work for him, but he only had one client, and this is something not to do. I mean, the one client wrote insurance. It was an insurance company. When they stopped writing policies, he had no more work. And I was actually on maternity leave with my second child. And when I called him back to tell him when I was going to return, he's like, "Oh, I'm sorry. For right now, I just have per diem work."
Oh, wow.
And I thought, well, I can't afford a nanny on a per diem job. And then my nanny moved out of town, and I said, well, let me just take the summer off and see what happens. And that was 13 years.
Oh, wow.
So luckily I could afford, to be a full-time mom. And meanwhile, I was always active in tons of community events, a local parks group, my political club, many things. Through my political club, I became friends with my current boss. So fast forward 13 years, I started applying for new jobs, and I happened to have a conversation with her. And she says, well, why don't you come to work for me? And so that's what I ended up doing. So that was lucky, although in a certain sense, maybe it wasn't luck, because, keeping yourself out there and being involved always presents an opportunity. And when I met my boss, I never knew that we would be anything other than friends or people who just had a mutual interest in East Side Manhattan politics. And so I went to work for her firm, which was the exact work that I used to do, and I enjoyed it. And she happened to be, and I wasn't even really 100% aware of the fact that she was running for judge. And after 2 years, she was elected. And in that time, we had already, almost immediately, we found that not only were we friends, but we actually worked well together. We had the same type of work habits. So when she was elected, it was almost, we never really had a conversation in which she said, would you be my court attorney? It was almost understood because she started saying, well, when we get to court,
That's fantastic.
wrap up the case. So I'm like, and it was funny. And we never really actually, maybe a couple of years later, I mentioned it to her, but that's how I ended up as a court attorney. I went back to work and I worked for someone who became a judge. And that's how I've had that job. And she was elected in 2017. So she began in 2018. So how many years is that? It's like 4 years, I think.
Yeah, over 4 years.
So this is probably the best job that I've had. I always thought I'd want to be a court attorney too. I knew that being active in politics and helping other people in their campaigns, it's just not something that I can do. I'm not a campaigner. So I knew that I would never want to be a judge because in New York it's an elected position. But being a court attorney is being the next best thing.
It is unusual about New York that we have these elections for judges, and
some states do. I think there's some states.
Yeah, there's a few states and other states that are appointed.
They're appointed, and there's good and bad to both. So it's pretty much, it's what you're used to or how the system is set up. But that's another topic. That's a topic.
That's entirely
its own podcast.
We could talk for a few hours about how judges are chosen in New York. But that's a fascinating story, and I think it's interesting that you were able to keep yourself, in the game, even though you were, taking some time off from your, working day to day in the legal career, but staying active enough, in New York, and keeping in touch with attorneys so that you could have something to go to, when you're ready to go back to work.
Right. Well, I knew that I would go back, and in fact, I actually didn't think it would be 13 years. I thought it would be a shorter period of time. So I always kept up my law license.
That's great.
And I would do the CLE, and I even had, I had a second phone line because this was the 90s. So I had a second phone line that I had like as a work line, and there was a fax machine connected to it. So there was always the intention to go back to work sooner rather than later. So I never wanted to give it up, and I didn't want to go on like a retirement status under the New York bar, then I'd have to pay fees to get back in, and it wasn't worth it.
Yeah, no, that's it's great, and it's nice that your law degree, allows that flexibility. Our law licenses.
Right. And I think a big thing too is one time I was at a political club meeting, and I overheard a young guy talking about how he just got into, I think it was Georgetown, and he mentioned what the tuition was, and I was shocked because it was easily 3 times what my tuition was. And I just couldn't believe the cost of a law school tuition and how it had skyrocketed. Maybe within 5 years of my graduation, it happened almost overnight. And I realized that I had long since paid off my loans, and my investment had long since paid for itself, and I would be stupid to start something new.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I don't think it's gone down at all, unfortunately.
No, it's not. Like this, oh my God, it's crazy.
So given that you've been able to practice both in private practice and public practice, what would you say the key differences are in practicing privately, in private practice versus in government service?
I think that private practice necessarily has to be more money driven.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes being money driven, it becomes a bigger consideration in your workday, and it detracts from what you need to do. So for instance, when you're billing by the hour, there's always an eye toward, if I don't bill, I'm not making money. And that penalizes you if you work quickly sometimes. It also penalizes you if you need more time to analyze something that's not typical, and then your client looks at the bill and says, well, I'm not paying for this. And you've got to that's on that. You've got to eat that time basically, and it's unfair, and it's a really hard business model. And I think that is, I think that kind of spoils the enjoyment of the practice of law sometimes when you have to
Mhm.
keep your eye on the business end of it. Whereas working in the court, I can write something quickly and I won't be penalized because it's quick.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I can spend hours. Like I get something that I don't understand, and it's like, wow, I have all this time. I can read, I can learn, and no one, and the work gets done. But I'm better able to spend more time on one thing and less time on another, as
Right.
is needed. Whereas in the private sector, you don't always have that luxury. Um, I don't know. I mean, my experience in the private sector was as an employee and not as a boss. So I know that being in charge of one's own firm, as you are, there's a lot of different considerations. And I think in government work, that could also be the case depending on who your boss is. And I happen to be lucky in that my boss is my friend.
Yeah.
So it's, if I have to leave early on a day, I'm not going to get penalized because she knows that I'll make the work up, that I work quickly, and that could be the case in the private sector too. But it's a little trickier, I think. So
No,
so
that's definitely true.
I think that would be key. Otherwise, the analyzing law, it's the same. I'm writing, I'm analyzing. That's pretty similar. But the other thing too is that people do treat the court with a certain degree of respect.
Mhm.
And being in the court system, if somebody is annoying, I have a better platform in which to kind of take them to task and say, "Excuse me, counselor. Well, court's open the day after Thanksgiving. We'll see you then. We'll be here." I can just little things like that. Not that I do that, but occasionally I have to actually, if you push me, occasionally I have to say, "Hey, this is how it
there are,
is. The court."
yeah. I mean, I can
So
see circumstances where that might be necessary, given my experience in,
yes,
in the courtroom with some of my fellow members of the bar, unfortunately.
right. No, it's sad, and I think women are still treated differently from men. Maybe not as much, maybe not as differently as when I was first starting out, but amazingly, it's still there. And sadly, I see it among attorneys who are 25 years younger than myself. It's like, has nothing changed? It's one thing you think, an older attorney, but when I see, people younger than myself, mostly men, acting a certain way, I'm just disappointed. So
Yeah, it is disappointing. I don't know when it's going to change, but
it's
we
just,
have to keep plugging away at it.
yeah, just kind of stick to it. What else? You have no choice, really. Try to enlighten as you go along. If you can change one mind, that's one more mind.
So good viewpoint. I mean, I also appreciate that there are the microphones in the court, because I find that if I try to use my loud voice, it sounds like I'm yelling
Right,
versus when a male uses his loud voice, it doesn't sound the same. And
right,
so, but if I speak with a normal tone, then it sometimes doesn't carry as much. So the
right,
microphones are helpful when they're working
right,
properly.
right.
Let's see, what's next? So, what do you value the most about being an attorney, like having your law license and practicing?
Um, I have to say, I think, and I've thought of this sometimes in the context of maybe changing careers. I think when I was out on, in that period where I didn't work, or in the immediate aftermath of having my second child when I was on maternity leave, before I realized that my boss couldn't take me back, I actually thought, should I look into something else? And was it a mistake to be an attorney? But I really, when I thought about it, I think being an attorney and having that license um, has given me confidence because I've done something that others haven't done. I have a body of knowledge that others don't have. But most importantly, I have the ability to analyze and figure things out in a way that others don't. And your brain is a muscle, and you're exercising it. And doing that, I'll be faced with a situation, outside of law, and I have that confidence to say, okay, let's take a step back. What's going on here? What do we need to do? Um, how can we figure out this problem? I'm trying to think of an example. I mean, I don't know, even being at a store and there's no salesperson, or somebody gets lost. All right, what should we do? Do you need help? let's find a guard. So being dispassionate, being logical, all of that, maybe part of me is naturally like that, but certainly being in law school and having that training and working has actually um, helped me and given me the confidence to really be assured of whatever conclusion I come to. So it's almost like, people say, well, I go to college, but I don't really need the degree. Well, sometimes you do need the degree to prove to others that you have. It's like an imprimatur, and it's the same way with law school, having a law degree. That you're not just blowing smoke. You know what you're talking about. You've thought about it. You have those skills, and that pretty much, I have that in the back of my mind. As I go about my day. So I think, yeah, I mean, that's kind of, yeah, I think that's not that I throw it around. I mean, there was a time early on when I first got out of school when being, it was in the days of that movie Wall Street. Now I'm dating myself, but greed is good, and it was all these obnoxious investment banker types, and they saw lawyers as the handmaidens to those.
Mm-hmm.
Not that I ever practiced that law in any way, shape, or form, and 90% of lawyers are working at small firms, barely,
You're not doing that.
not making, no one's not, they're all not getting houses in the Hamptons, but people, the average person doesn't know that.
Right.
And yes, maybe the average law school graduate does a little better than the average college graduate, but we're still in the same group pretty much. So, so at first I might not have been throwing my weight around like, oh, I'm a lawyer, and I don't do that. But internally, I kind of know, all right, here's the problem. I know how to approach this.
You can handle something. You can handle
Right.
something that you're facing, and you can figure out a solution.
Right. And sometimes I think I might telegraph that, because since we started working in the court system, sometimes, I like to dress up. I don't dress down. I think that's important for women. A lot of younger women don't believe that, but
I agree. I believe that.
See how your experience plays out, because I always dress in a skirt suit. Is it the most comfortable clothing? No, it's not, but it's a uniform, and you're playing a role. And as RuPaul says, life is drag. So you got to wear your costume for wherever you're doing. So I've noticed that in the courthouse, people address me as judge, in elevators, or even when I'm talking to lawyers. I think I'll say I'm the court attorney, but then they'll forget. So I think it's maybe because, and I would joke around, it's like, oh, because I'm old, and people would be like, no, you just, someone once said, no, you're just judgy. And I'm like, okay, thank you. She goes, oh, no, not in a bad way, but just, so I take it to mean, I kind of maybe project. And, and on the street, I'm asked for directions constantly. And this was always the case with me. So maybe I'm just walking around projecting an aura of confidence, maybe. I don't know. Right. But it's interesting to me and funny in a way, because I've never felt it. And I've always been conscious of trying, like it's not natural.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to feel confident. I'm trying to be confident.
That's an important muscle also to build,
yes.
Right? The confidence muscle, something, they used to say, fake it till you make it, but it's really just being, practicing having confidence and speaking with confidence.
Right. And certainly the training to be an attorney, it gives you that. I mean, starting in law school, when you're surrounded by people that are really smart and they're talking, and they're like, what are you talking about? Just being able to hold your own with people like that. And then starting out as a junior attorney with people who know so much more. It's like, well, yeah, do it this way. And you're like, oh, okay. So just being able to kind of go through that and coming out the other end, That's why I say to the young attorneys, it's like what we said at the beginning, take the long view. It's a process, and you're always learning, and you've got law degree and you've gotten through law school. So more than half the battle is won, and you'll get there.
So on that note, would you recommend a career in law to women who are thinking about, what they want to do, what kind of career they want? Would you recommend a legal career?
It's interesting. I've gone back and forth on that. I have 2 daughters, and the joke used to be, my husband was also an attorney, and we'd be like, oh, we don't want our kids to be lawyers. And I think at the time we were viewing it from the perspective of how hard the practice of law has become, like what I said earlier about always having to have your eye on the bottom line and making money and billing your time and all of that. And it's tough. And as we've gotten older, I think the law has, the opportunities have shrunk. I think that, and I don't know this from reading anything specifically, but just the sense was that there were fewer jobs to go around. So there was a time, I don't know, maybe 15 or more years ago, where I would discourage people from being lawyers, and I'd say, well, now the cost is so much, you really have to, really have to love it. It's law school is hard work. It can be very tedious. You could get discouraged. When I was in law school, law school was still cheap enough so that a lot of people actually went to law school because they didn't, they were liberal arts majors who didn't know what they wanted to do after graduation.
Yeah.
So they were able to park themselves for 3 years, rather than get like a master's in history, because if you don't want to be a teacher, what's the point in getting a master's in anything? And my apologies to those who differ, but in a general, it really is the route to academia, is getting degrees because you want to teach. But if you don't want to teach, then what's the point? And right, and at least with law school, there's the idea of there is a job waiting for you on the other end. So I knew a lot of people in law school that went because their father was a lawyer and wanted them to do it, or they had nothing else to do, or they didn't know what they wanted to do and wanted to think for another 3 years. And I don't think people today have that luxury at all. I mean, you're barely paying for college, and law school is just as much money. And so so on the one hand, I wouldn't be cavalier and say, oh no, don't go to law school. But I would say that you have to think carefully about whether you like this kind of work, because it's not really something you can try out while you're in school, because you're paying a lot of money and it's very tedious and it's going to take up a lot of your time. What I would tell people is that if they're not 100%, I was one of those people who in grade school, I knew I wanted to be a lawyer. If you're not one of those people, then I tell people that the beauty of law is that you can go to law school at any age, really. You can be in your 40s. In my class, when I was in law school, half the class was out of school a year or more at that point, and the school was actually proud of that. But the thing is that you don't have to be. It's not like medical school where you have to just do it while you're young, because it's grueling. It's not grueling in the same way. You can do it when you're in your 40s. So you can work at a law firm. You could work as a paralegal. I know a young person who actually wasn't sure, and was interested in labor relations, and then actually spent a few years working for a federal agency. I can't think of the name of the agency, but was doing work like that, and maybe did labor relations work for a company, or just did something, and then finally at the age of 30 applied to law school. So I would say that if you have an interest, then if it's not 100%, then give yourself some time, because you do have that time, and weigh the options. And unfortunately, money has to be a consideration. But apart from that, if you're thinking just generally, would a career in law be something? I think it's a good career because it's so broad, and it can, having the confidence that comes with having a law degree, the body of knowledge, the skill set, and if you're good in numbers, unlike me, if you're good in numbers, doing transactional work, being a lawyer sometimes leads to careers that are not necessarily law related. If you look at CEOs of various corporations, I can't think of any off the top of my head other than the guy that was the head of Disney who retired. He was a lawyer. A lot of business people, when you read up, they started out as lawyers in various industries. So there's that. And then there's people like me who don't have those skill sets, but yet, writing and doing litigation work is the other set, is the other half. Or just being able to write can open doors for you in other areas. I know that consulting work is a big thing now. I don't know what consulting work is, but if they're hiring people right out of college to be consultants, I would think that as a lawyer with the extra skills and the extra abilities, you could be a consultant too if you get tired of law. So I don't know. So I guess, and it's kind of a long way of saying that would I recommend it as a career? I would say generally yes. As a career in and of itself, it's a good career to have. And then, to dig a little deeper and say, well, is it something that you could, is it something that matches your skill set, that's a whole other issue.
Right.
But you have the time to figure that out. You have the time to figure it out.
And it offers you flexibility.
Yes.
A great deal of flexibility.
Right. And you can go back to it. I mean,
Mhm.
and I hate to say this, but I think part of why, I mean, while I was not working, which was 13 years, I would read about women going back to work, and it wouldn't necessarily be in law, but it would be generally, especially, tech. Their skills atrophied in a very short time. The corporate world, I don't know what the corporate world is like. The term corporate world is such a general catch-all that I guess it would depend on your industry, but I think that whatever your industry is, it might be something that would go stale after a couple of years if you don't keep up your contacts. I mean, tech is just one example, but I don't know. Say you're in advertising. I mean, any type of business is always growing and changing, and if you're out of it for too long, then there's a detriment. And I remember reading about how hard it was for women to get back into the workforce. They've kind of lost the level that they were at when they left, and part of me is like, well, it's unfair to penalize women for being out of the workforce. But on the other side, if anyone is out of something for 10 or more years,
Yeah.
I don't think they should be paid the same as people who've been working for 10 years, because
the whole time. Yeah.
your levels are not the same.
Mm-hmm.
So it's difficult. However, law has the advantage of really not changing all that much.
Right.
Notwithstanding what's going on with the Supreme Court, the actual way that, say, a contract case or a real estate case, or just interpreting a contract or a lease, that hasn't changed. The principles of what constitutes a contract have been the same for, I don't know,
Yeah.
since I don't know. Well, who is that? I'm blanking now on the guy in England, since King John or whoever. I mean, for centuries. Yeah. In other words, centuries. Blackstone. Okay, since
Blackstone.
It really hasn't changed. And when I went back to work, a lot of people said to me, "Oh, my first week back. Oh, how was it?" And honestly, it was like I never left. I came, I sat down. I'm like, "Oh, okay. There's motions to do." I mean, maybe a couple of things have changed. Like now you have to have HIPAA forms, and maybe the procedures have changed. Now you got to pay a fee for, opening the door to the courthouse or something. I don't know. But apart from that, everything was the same. There was no learning curve.
That's amazing.
And at the same time, I couldn't say that I was entitled to command the salary I would have commanded had I been working for the past 13 years. But it wasn't long until I didn't lose that. Right. Yeah. I didn't lose the time from not practicing.
Right.
And because those skills really are timeless, and the field, like I said, is not changing. You're going to write a motion the same way. You're going to argue the same way. You're going to deal with a client the same way that you did 20 years before. So that's why. So law in that sense is a good field. You can drop in and out of it. You can change fields entirely. I mean, I always liked being a litigator. I recently went to my law school classes reunion, which I'm not going to say. It was a milestone year, not a big milestone year, and I'm probably dating myself already, but it was pretty big. It wasn't 50 years, but it was big enough that they had us on their schedule, but not big enough that not many people came. But it's interesting, though, for the people that showed up to just learn what they've done. And sometimes you start in one field and then you start in one totally, you can start over doing something totally different. Well, like I did. I mean, I started in transactional work and then moved to litigation. So that's also a good thing about law. And because it's a profession. So it's not just a career. It's actually a profession. With its own set of behaviors and groups and all of that, and it's right. Cohesive. So yeah, I think that's what makes law different too. It's a profession, and unlike medicine, I think it really does speak to a larger skill set. It does have room to have a lot of different people in it, and being able to run with those types of people enriches you as a person as well. It's more likely that people who study law in a country outside the U.S. can come to the US and practice law here
Right.
after taking the year, just passing the bar. It's the same. Whereas I think with doctors and people in some medical fields, it's tough. Sometimes if you're a doctor in another country, it's hard to then come here and be a doctor in the same on the same level, you know.
Right. It's just different.
So,
You're actually learning different things,
right,
entirely different concepts sometimes.
right. So in general, yes, I think law is a good career for women.
So I want to discuss something outside of law for a moment. I'm very impressed that you've managed to cultivate an entirely separate profession of sorts, and that your musical career that you've developed over the last, I don't know, many years, but
About 10 years.
10 years.
10 years. It'll be 10 years
And
this
I'm
fall.
so proud and so impressed that you've really developed this whole other side of what you do. So could you tell us a little bit about your musical career and how you've able
Right.
to put that into your legal practice?
Right. Well, I'm a drummer. You probably couldn't. Nobody could guess that I play the drums. I actually play the drums, and just to back up, it didn't. Somebody when I first started taking lessons, somebody said to me like, "Oh, what did you just like wake up one day and say, hey, I want to play the drums?" I'm like, "Yeah, I did that, but I was 11, and girls didn't really play the drums." So I've always loved music. I come from a musical family. My father was he played the accordion, and it was never his main job, but it was actually he was in a union and he played um, at, believe it or not, there was a time when one could use music gigs to supplement your income, and
Mm.
that's what my father did. He and his uncles and cousins, they all played the accordion, and my father was going to night school and he worked full time, and he played the accordion on weekends for
Oh, wow.
weddings back when you needed live bands for everything. He had income coming in from that. Now it's the reverse. Now you've got to basically, drive a FedEx truck in order to be a full-time musician, until you make the big time. But in any event, so I come from a musical family. I played the organ and the piano as a kid. I never liked playing in front of people, so I never really even considered it to be a career. I was just too shy. But I always loved music. I stopped playing the piano once I got to college, and I just didn't have time. And then once I moved out of my parents' house, I had no piano. But I always loved music, and I didn't realize that I was not typical of others because who doesn't love music? But it was something that was always a part of my life and how I think about the world and my memories. And when I had kids, my both my kids took music lessons, and my older daughter, in addition to playing the violin, also took voice lessons. And she took voice lessons at a school that was near us in Midtown. And they actually were a community school at the time, and they would teach instruments and whatever to anyone, to adults.
Oh, wow.
So I saw a little boy playing the drums, and I thought, oh, I wonder if they would give me drum lessons. And it's more like, do you have a checkbook? Yes. Okay, we'll give you drum lessons. So, and I started playing the drums, and by then, I was home full time. So I
Yeah.
did have the time. Now, that's not to say that I wouldn't have had time when I was working,
Yeah.
but I think that what I wanted to do was sort of catch up because when a middle-aged woman sits behind a drum set, you don't expect her to sound like she's 12. So
Right.
I would practice 3 or 4 hours a day in the
Oh,
beginning
wow.
just to kind of catch up. But at the same time, I was musical. I had a sense of rhythm. So it was not something that I really was learning from scratch, or it wasn't really that out of the blue. But being home full time gave me the opportunity for the let's see, first 3.5 years, I was able to just practice a lot because then after 3.5 years, I did go back to work. And after that, I really did have to just schedule. I bought muffles for my drums, so I had to practice in the evenings. But I really kept it up. And the next step, when you play the drums, is it's not like you can play the piano alone in your basement, which is what I did as a teenager. You got to be in a band. And someone I knew at the music school where I was taking lessons, he was also an adult taking guitar lessons, and he told me about a guitar school in the city that put together adult rock bands. And that's how I'm like, all right, let me check that out,
That's
and
fantastic.
the rest is history. And I went to this thing. They were a very welcoming organization, and I met tons of other people who either were just learning their instruments in midlife or played as teenagers and really had no outlet, especially guitar players. So many people played the guitars. Everybody wants to be Eric Clapton. So, you had a lot of people. and they always needed drummers because you don't really have a lot of drummers. You don't have very many women drummers. And so I just got involved, and after playing briefly with one band, they would have these sessions where you'd get lessons, and then they'd sponsor a showcase where all the student bands would play. I found the band that I'm in now, and we've been together since 2014, and we started out playing covers. I think of the four of us, the original, only two were in the original lineup, and they were two guitarists who actually learned to play guitar at the guitar school. We went through a couple of bass players. I was their first drummer because they always had a teacher as the drummer, because they're always short on drummers. The bass player played bass as a teenager, but also was taking guitar lessons as a new instrument. And so the four of us have been together in our current iteration, maybe since 2016, I think. Yeah, so not too long after I joined them. And we went from playing all covers to now we play mostly originals. One of us writes the bulk of the songs, not me. I'm not a songwriter. One of us writes the bulk of the songs. Another one has written a few of the songs. And so once you start playing more originals, it's easier to get gigs. And, bars around town want to have cheap entertainment. So you don't have to be Green Day to get these gigs. In fact, Green Day's not playing at your local pub. That's not what it's there for. So I began to see that there was also a niche to be filled, which was cheap entertainment. And as long as you bring in X amount of people, you can play anywhere. And that's what we did for a few years. And then by 2019, one of my bandmates, who's a flight attendant actually, and whose brother is a drummer and plays regularly as a side thing, had a contact in England. And long story short, we actually had a little tour of England in 2019, where we had a couple of gigs in the north of England as a favor, through the person my bandmate's brother knew. And she booked us a few in London on her own, the same way you book them here, because she'd be back and forth to London as part of her job on layovers. And it went so well that we were invited back. And then the pandemic happened. So we actually, we didn't play publicly, like everyone else until, 2021, maybe that fall we played a little bit. So meanwhile, our 2020 tour got canceled, our 2021 tour got canceled. Yeah. We'd go in May, so that was canceled. And then September of 2021, we played a couple of gigs, but then, I don't know, it's like the history of coronavirus, then there was a spike, and then we all stopped playing, and then we came back in this spring. But meanwhile, we did book our gigs again in England for this past May, and miraculously it happened. So that was about a little over a month ago. We returned from our tour, and this time we had more gigs. We had like 8 gigs.
Oh wow!
And it was a ton of fun. It was a ton of fun. So I'm hoping we'll do it again. We've already been invited, so I'm hoping we'll do it again. And I'm hoping, we're kind of taking the summer off, but hopefully, if conditions permit, we can get back to playing more so in the fall and over the winter. And I will say about practicing, once I learned the instrument, once I wasn't a beginner, even though my time was increasingly limited as I went back to work, it also is the case where you don't need to practice 3 hours a day anymore. So I think 1 is sufficient, or more on weekends, because that's just the nature of playing an instrument. So yes, I did benefit from 3 years of being home and able to devote time to the drums. But it was only 3 hours a day. Otherwise, you'd go nuts. I still had to cook, clean, and take care of the kids, and do my continuing legal education and all my other volunteer work. So, but yeah. So now, and I will say that working in the court system where I don't have to work until 8 o'clock at night is also helpful. So I can leave when the courthouse shuts at 5 o'clock, and I can go home and play for an hour, and then we rehearse once a week. And I don't take lessons anymore, but I want to do like a one-off occasionally. I mean, during the during the height of the pandemic, really, I was doing Zoom lessons with my teacher, which wasn't the greatest, but I'd already been taking lessons for like 8 years, so I was probably ready to get weaned anyway. But it's good for an amateur like myself to kind of check in with a professional every so often. And I actually learned that professionals always have someone checking in, and having a producer of some sorts listen to them and make arrangement suggestions. So So it's not just for amateurs. So just as an aside, I learned so much about music and how the business of music works. It's just interesting. It's just interesting to me.
That's fantastic.
So,
It's I think it's so great that you've developed that other outlet for your creative, keep the creative juices going, and just another point of interest, because I feel like sometimes attorneys, we have sort of tunnel vision. We spend so much time working and focused on our career that we don't really develop outside interests, and then people ask us a question unrelated to the law, and we're kind of
I know.
like deer in the headlights.
Exactly.
So much to say.
And that's too bad. And I think that that's a function of young attorneys, the expectation that you have to work 14 or 18-hour days. And you know what? That's wrong.
Yeah.
That's the wrong premise to start from. And that has to change in some way. But, we've been saying this for, as long as I've been a lawyer, but that's the key, really. You've got to have other things going on in your life.
Okay, Robin, I have last 3 quick fire questions for you. These should be quick ones.
Okay.
But we'll see.
Depends on how long I talk. I can talk fast.
If you couldn't be an attorney, what career would you choose?
I think something in government, really. I think that was where my interests always were, maybe in urban planning, working for a government agency. Because I was so focused on law school, I never got a chance to really explore what else there was out there in public service. Maybe briefly, I looked at the Foreign Service because somebody had come to my college to speak about his work as a Foreign Service officer. So I thought that was interesting. But probably something in public service, I think. Not music. I never, ever, ever saw music as a career. I think that you kind of know instinctively if you're headed in that direction, and it wasn't a thing for me.
Interesting. What is the one thing you wish you knew when you graduated law school that you know now?
That people that are senior to you and have years and years of practice don't know everything. They really don't. And sometimes I would always get the impression that, oh my God, I have to, this person is right all the time, and I have to rise to that level. Or if somebody would tell me something, like a boss, and I'm talking in a workplace, a work environment, I would just go along with it instead of questioning it, which you really have to do, because so the one thing is that, people who are your professional, maybe even intellectual superiors, really don't know everything. And a lot of people don't know what they're doing and know how to cover it up. So I wish I knew that immediately.
And you touched on this one briefly earlier, but I don't know if you gave a definitive answer, but would you recommend a law career to your children in particular?
Well, yeah, and I think my answer would sort of continue on from what I had said previously. I think, apart from, and I've abandoned the initial feeling that my husband and I had was, oh, don't go into law. I think that if this is where your interest and skill sets lie, then I think that it would be it's worthwhile to look into. And I certainly can tell you why I like being a lawyer and how it's benefited me. And my older daughter has no interest, but my younger daughter has an interest. She doesn't have the same, like, oh, I'm going to be a lawyer, the way I was in grade school, but she's really thinking about it. And I'm just telling her to explore all your options. And I tell her, I discuss more about my work with her, because if it's something that she thinks she'd be good at and something that she thinks she'd enjoy, then I would support her financially, as well as moral support and advice.
Wow. That's wonderful.
So I wouldn't steer them away as like, oh, it's a terrible profession, because it's not. It really isn't. And maybe you can change it for the better, or help to.
Exactly. I mean, I actually think there's a lot of benefits in being in the law as a female. I think that it gives us a lot of autonomy to really shape our careers in a way that a lot of other careers don't, and the ability to earn a really decent living, even if you're not, at the top of big law, you can still make an adequate living.
Oh, absolutely.
With your law degree, and you don't have to be dependent on other people. So,
oh yeah,
for me, those are reasons why.
Big law is a fraction of legal jobs. People, like I said earlier, people don't realize that it is not. It's a small percentage of lawyers.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, Robin. This has been so much fun.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed it. It's been
my
a real
pleasure.
pleasure to have you on, and I hope to see you soon at a Colombian Lawyers event.
Thanks. Maybe tomorrow.
Is it tomorrow? Oh, yes.
There's a legal education. It's a Zoom.
Yes.
You've been listening to Success in Brief with your host, Rosanne Felicello. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, and sharing the show with others. You can catch prior episodes at www.felicellolaw.com and on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and more. You've been listening to Success in Brief with your host, Rosanne Felicello. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, and sharing the show with others. You can catch prior episodes at www.felicellolaw.com and on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and more.